Good morning, everyone. Well, it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Carol Bacchi to you today. Her presentation will be on deploying a post-structural analytical strategy, political implications. I'll just open her slideshow as we're going. Carol Bacchi is Professor Emerita of Politics at the University of Adelaide. She researches and writes in the field of policy theory, feminist political theory, embodiment and citizenship, and mobility studies. Over the past 40 years, she's encouraged the rethinking of taken-for-granted truths about women's history, equality policy, and public policy in general. Her major publications include Same Difference, Feminism and Sexual Difference, Women, Policy and Politics, the Construction of Policy Problems, and Analysing Policy, what's the problem represented to be. Her new book, Post-Structural Policy Analysis, A Guide to Practice, is written with Susan Goodwin, and it includes an appendix which introduces a new post-structural approach to interview analysis. And we have some flyers for that book out on the registration table, so if you're interested in having a look at it, please pick up one of the flyers. But on a personal note, I'm really delighted that Carol has agreed to join us this year. Her WPR approach has had a really significant impact on our field. It's prompted new research questions and invited us to analyse issues in what I think are highly novel and productive ways. Please welcome Carol.
Could you open? Oh, you've done that. And let's just check.
Yeah.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Suzanne for the lovely introduction. I'd like to thank all the organisers for making this conference possible. It's my first trip to Finland, and it won't be my last. It's an absolutely magnificent city that I visited yesterday. I've been following developments in your field with great interest. I've been absolutely thrilled to see the active engagement with WPR and other aspects of my work. In this interaction, I have learned a great deal, not just about the substantive content of what is being studied in AOD, but also through engagement with varieties of contemporary political and social theory, most recently the so-called ontological turn. So my remit for today is not to reintroduce the WPR approach, which many of you already use, but to develop one of its key propositions: the need to replace problems with problematizations. And I'm going to reflect on how problematizations connect to the so-called ontological turn. Problems, I argue, are never exogenous to or outside of social and political practice. The word problem is at best meaningless and at worst positively dangerous. It is, I'd suggest, most dangerous in the field of alcohol and drugs research, where making alcohol and drug use problems is rife. Alcohol problems, in inverted commas, and drug problems, in inverted commas, operate as taken-for-granted descriptions of conditions that ought to be rectified or eliminated. The terms, alcohol problems, drug problems, are heavily and negatively value-laden, indicated by their common association with social problems. As I suggest in the new book that Suzanne mentioned, Here we have problems with a capital P. Just as examples, the recent fact sheet produced by the Australian government headed, "What is the ice problem?" And the Health Department's module, "What is intoxication and why is it a problem?" Now, I'm going to be giving a presentation in a few months' time entitled provocatively, deliberately, "Declaring War on Problems," a call to rein in the concept. The suggestion in this title is that currently the concept problem is running wild and needs to be tamed. Now, this project is complicated by at least two factors. First, the use of the term problem by philosophers associated with varieties of post-structuralism, including Canguilhem, Bergson, Foucault, and Deleuze. Both Canguilhem and Bergson, with Deleuze, called for the creation of problems. The second complicating factor for my project, Declaring War on Problems, is the endorsement of something called problem-driven research by the post-structural scholars Glynis and Howarth, who are following Ian Shapiro. Shapiro, in his famous article in 2002, endorses problem-driven research as an alternative to theory-driven research, where he says, quote, "A phenomenon is characterized so as to vindicate a particular theory rather than to illuminate a problem that is specified independently of the theory." So, complications. Clearly, uses of the term problem, as with all concepts, have to be considered within the projects to which they are attached. As another example, recently, the writer and public speaker Eckhart Tolle declared, "So one could say that the only problem is dysfunctional thinking. The rest are challenges, not problems." Tolle is best known as the author of The Power of Now and A New Earth, Awakening to Your Life's Purpose. His message can be linked to the positive psychology movement, which I tend to see as individualizing and depoliticizing. So here, I found myself in the uncomfortable position of preferring the language of problems to challenges. This discussion is clearly associated with a larger issue. The need to reflect on the forms of politics our particular theoretical stances and their associated terminologies make possible. In this talk, I want to emphasize what is gained in respect of political analysis and on-the-ground political effects from replacing problems with problematizations. Part of this argument, and the part that I'll stress today, relates to the place of problematization as a concept in the constitutive stance associated with the ontological turn. That is, with the argument that practices constitute subjects and objects. I'm going to be suggesting that problematizations form a key part of those analyses. So as an outline, I'll say a little bit about the WPR approach and what problematizations can offer in terms of political analysis, and then how problematizations relate to considerations of enactment and the ontological turn. Unfortunately, I can't assume that everyone in the audience is already using WPR, or they know what it has to do with. Hence, I need to say a few words about it. I describe it as an analytic strategy for critical policy analysis. It draws on some Foucauldian interventions, including archaeology, genealogy, and problematization, to produce a series of interrelated questions and forms of analysis, as you can see on the chart that has been distributed with your materials this morning. So that's the most recent iteration of the approach, which has changed since it was first introduced in 1999. Now, the principal objective of the WPR approach is to identify and interrogate the problematizations within policies. And this is achieved through critical analysis of problem representations, which is a term that I've coined, how problems are conceptualized and produced as particular sorts of problems within policies. I stress within policies to distinguish the approach from interpretive studies that focus on how people, such as policy workers, problematize issues. In WPR, the interest is on how problems are characterized and conceptualized within policies. So returning briefly to the different projects associated with the term problem, while Bergson and Deleuze emphasize the need to participate in creating or constituting problems, WPR offers a way to interrogate how problems are constituted in specific sites, policies, programs, projects, and other sites to follow. So it offers a form of critical analysis of existing problem representations rather than shaping problems for a possible future. Doubtless, it would be worthwhile to consider to what extent these two projects might, at some level, prove to be complementary. However, while creating problems implies an ability to legislate as to the universe of problems and solutions that might be available to us, and here I'm quoting Thomas Osborne, interrogating problems, as in a WPR approach, institutes a commitment to a form of ongoing critique, an open-ended provocation of the problematic, as I proceed to elaborate. The thinking behind the WPR approach relies upon a very simple proposition. What we propose to do about something reveals what we think needs to change, and hence, what we think is problematic, what we think the problem is. In accord with the goal of examining how problems are constituted in policies, the analysis starts in question 1 from proposals or proposed solutions from the policies and works backwards to see how problems are produced as particular sorts of problems within them. If you could think of your own work and think of some sort of a proposal that you've encountered, and then look at that proposal and think backwards to how the problem is assumed as a particular kind of problem within it, you'll get the idea of the fundamental logic at work. An example here, a common policy proposal to improve women's representation in positions of influence and in better paying jobs is to offer them training programs. I swear I get an invitation every day to take a training program to improve my status. I don't know, maybe the men get them too. We'll have to discuss that. But if training programs is the proposal, proposed solution, policy, whatever language suits you best, then clearly women's lack of training is produced as the problem. Well, you might say that's obvious. In its very obviousness, it gives us a way forward. It gives us something to focus on. Here I'm making the point that the problem representation is implicit within the proposal. You don't have to go outside it to find the problem representation. You look at the proposal and you work backwards to how the problem is represented. So WPR is not concerned with whoever makes this suggestion about training programs, but with the conceptual logic within the proposal as it appears in a policy text for the time being. So, to get at the conceptual logic, it looks at the presuppositions and assumptions in what Foucault called the unexamined ways of thinking, knowledges, rationalities, together with the conditions of, once again from Foucault, emergence, insertion, and functioning that make the proposal possible and intelligible. All right. Identifying then problem representations as implicit within proposals ensures that they are not seen simply as interpretations. Rather, they form part of how we are governed. They are in the proposal, so therefore they are part of a governing practice. Problem representations, therefore, are enacted as part of the real through their incorporation within policy proposals. It follows, I maintain, that we're not governed through policies at all. We're governed through their problematizations, through how the problems are conceptualized within them. The argument that every proposal contains an implicit representation of the problem means that there are no problems separate from the proposals purported to address them. So here I'll stick out my neck and I'll say problems as such do not exist. They are always shaped through proposals. So such thinking turns vague references to, we have a problem here, into specific targets for analysis and critique, women's lack of training, providing a focus for applying the remaining steps in the WPR approach. To date, the focus among researchers has been on using the WPR approach to examine policy texts, which is what it was developed for. In several places, I have broadened the ambit of the approach beyond policy analysis, describing it as a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking critically that can be used to interrogate the full range of governmental and knowledge practices. So this way of thinking involves considering a wide range of materials as proposals in a very broad sense. We have to think laterally here, working backwards to see how they represent the problem. So we ask, if this is the proposal, if this is the recommendation for how things ought to be, what is put forward as needing to change? Hence, what is rendered problematic. I show, for example, how the approach can be used to critically analyze theoretical propositions, both those we dislike and those we embrace, which are in effect forms of proposal. Theories are forms of proposal, so you can analyze theories. With similar logic, it's possible to apply the approach to concepts, which Tannasini describes helpfully as proposals about how we ought to proceed from here. So this creative rethinking of the meaning of concept opens it up to a WPR analysis. I also suggest its possible application to texts other than policy texts. There have been several such applications in the AOD field. The examples I've got here are to analyze case law and precedent, symposia, high-impact law journals, and social marketing texts. The new book describes WPR as a fruitful way to approach governmental technologies, such as modes of measurement and inscription. For example, funding models, such as the episode of CARE model, studied by Moore and Fraser. Signs, maps, qualies, dailies. I skipped the reference to the application to interviews because Suzanne already mentioned it. And the same thinking can be applied to other technologies. It looks like I'm on some sort of an imperialistic mission here to take over all analysis for WPR. I was asked to think about what I meant, and this is what came out. So the approach can also be applied to other technologies, diagnostic instruments such as DSM, opinion polling, I've done a bit of work on that, and social attitude surveys. It can also be applied to phenomena that are not strictly textual, and objects not found in formal documents, such as ceremonies, as spoken and acted text, organizational culture as symbols, and buildings. Think of buildings as proposals. For example, you could study how modern schools, with their unipurpose facilities, located on enclosed land, fenced and gated, think about that the next time you drop off your kids, how they reflect the hidden curriculum that problematizes the moral and cognitive training of young people. Bottrell and Meager recommend that WPR applied in the whole field of practice research, where the focus of analysis is on establishing which interventions work to solve which problems. Well, the logic that these authors critique here has clear connections to evidence-based policy frameworks, where the mantra of what works is alive and well, and has an assumed sub-theme to solve a particular problem. Importantly, as some of you have researched, such evidence-based approaches establish relations of governing that privilege those who get to set the problems that we then are invited to apply to study. This example illustrates my earlier claim that references to problems, either explicit or implied, are politically dangerous and need to be reined in. As an alternative, I suggest a turn to problematizations. So we now have to take a quantum leap into some Foucault. For those with jet lag, I apologize. Hang in there. I'm going to talk about the usefulness of the term problematization. I'll have to deal briefly with some pretty complex stuff. Basically, Foucault uses problematization in two ways. First, as a critical strategy. He talks about thinking problematically, which is close, adequate for our purposes, to the way that we use the term when we say, you want to problematize something. But our focus today is his second usage as a historical process of producing objects for thought. How and why certain things, behavior, phenomena, processes become a problem. These problematized phenomena become problematizations in the plural, and they are the focus for study. And Nicholas Rose explains how this form of analysis works. He says, If policies, arguments, analyses, and prescriptions purport to provide answers, they do so only in relation to a set of questions. Their very status as answers is dependent upon the existence of those questions. If, for example, imprisonment, marketization, community care are seen as answers, or in my language, as proposals, to what are they answers? And, in italics, in reconstructing the problematizations which accord them intelligibility, which make them intelligible as answers, these grounds become visible, and their limits and presuppositions are opened for investigation in new ways. Taking one of Rose's examples, marketization. The task becomes inquiring into the emergence of that practice, or more precisely, those practices, and reconstructing the problematizations that offer the rationale for those practices, rendering marketization intelligible as an answer. So, as we discussed earlier, the point of this form of analysis is to identify the presuppositions underpinning this problematization and to investigate them, identifying their limits. I'd like to emphasize this last point to ensure that the political implications of this form of analysis do not get missed. So we're not just describing them, we are assessing them and identifying their limits. I use the example from Rose to illustrate the level of analysis provoked by the study of problematizations. As mentioned earlier, we're not talking here about competing interpretations of a problem, which is a common focus in interpretive accounts. Rather, we're talking about how governing takes place through problematizations. How, in order for something to be governed or imagined as governable, it needs to be problematized. It follows that the study of problematizations provides important insights into modes of governing. For example, Dean and Hindus describe a neoliberal rationality as a style of problematization, a mode of reasoning that can best be identified by examining problematizations. So if I'm looking at how issues are problematized, how things are problematized, you can say something about the mode of governing that is being implemented. And as Dean insists, there's a critical analytical task that goes with that, and that's discerning which of these problematizations indicate lines of fracture and transformation, and which indicate a consolidation of existing regimes of government. Okay, so where do problematizations come from? Where do they appear? How do we gain access to them? Foucault tells us that problematizations emerge from practices. Well, that should help us, but of course, the term practices has many, many different meanings. Given his nominalism and his fondness for spatial and geographical metaphors, Foucault describes practices as places, where what is said and what is done, rules imposed and reasons given, the planned and the taken for granted meet and interconnect. He's always so helpful, isn't he? Happily, Thomas Flynn gave us an example to see what this means. He says, the practice of legal punishment entails the interplay between a code that regulates ways of acting, such as how to discipline an inmate. So those are the rules imposed. And the production of true-false discourse that legitimates those ways of acting. That's the reasons given. So you've got the rules imposed and the reasons given. To Foucault, that gives us a practice. From this example, we can see that Foucault was interested in particular kinds of practices. Those that establish and apply norms, controls, and exclusions, and that render true-false discourse possible. In short, he directed his attention to governing practices. Now, Foucault wished to access the thought, the thinking, in those practices, and it was for that purpose that he turned to problematization later in his life. And I have a quote from Maurice Florence, which was Foucault, and we can see in this quote coming up the connections that Foucault draws between practices and the constitution of subjects and objects, which is our overall theme here, and the place of problematization in that connection. So, he tells us the researcher first studies the practices, ways of doing things, through which one can grasp the lineaments of what was constituted as real for those who were attempting to conceptualize and govern it, and of the way in which these same people constituted themselves as subjects capable of knowing, analyzing, and ultimately modifying the real. These practices, understood, you notice he put it in inverted commas, simultaneously as modes of action and of thinking, are what provide the key to understanding a correlative constitution of the subject and the object. The way in which this form of analysis works is best illustrated with an example. Recall, we're working here with Foucault's second meaning of problematization, and that's a historical process of producing objects for thought. And the example we're looking at is madness. According to Foucault, to understand how madness was produced as an object for thought, it is necessary to examine the following practices. I like this example because we actually get a list of practices, just what he means by practices. How madmen were recognized, set aside, excluded from society, interned, and treated. What institutions were meant to take them in and keep them there, sometimes caring for them. What authorities decided on their madness and according with what criteria. What methods were set in place to constrain them, punish them, or cure them. In short, what was the network of institutions and practices in which the madman was simultaneously caught and defined? Importantly, Foucault here is not questioning the existence of something real that is being regulated. However, this thing is not madness until it is produced through the practices he describes. And to trace the dynamic by which this occurs, Foucault asks, how and why were very different things in the world gathered together, characterized, analyzed, and treated as, for example, mental illness? The answer to this question, he explains, provides the elements deemed relevant for a given problematization. So therefore, by looking at what was done, the practices, to those called mad, we can see how they were problematized, how they were conceptualized as a specific kind of phenomenon and made real. In this way, attention is directed to the conditions of emergence, or to use Anne-Marie Moll's term, the practices of coordination, involved in collecting together things, actions, gestures, behaviors, and words that make up madness as an object for thought and the mad as real subjects. As seen here, problematizations then provide a key link in the constitutive role of practices. Helpfully for our talk, Foucault then proceeds to spell out the political implications of identifying problematizations. He says it was a matter of first determining the role of politics and ethics in the establishment of madness as a particular domain of scientific knowledge. So the politics involved in the coming to be of madness. And second, the other political implications, analyzing the effects of that created real on political and ethical practices, how the mad were treated. So the main purpose of studying problematizations is to establish a critical distance from objects such as madness as fixed essences. As Paul Vane explains, there are no natural objects. There are only multiple objectivizations. What a wonderful word. His examples are population, fauna, and subjects under law. And these he describes as correlatives of heterogeneous practices. As a result, the analytic emphasis shifts from presumed objects, sexuality, madness, addiction, drugs, to the relations and mechanisms involved in their becoming, to the politics necessarily involved in the production of the real. So showing how these things have come to be real opens up space to contest them, which is an important political intervention. So I'm arguing that problematizations provide an activating factor in this production of the real, illustrating their crucial contribution to the ontological turn, or more specifically, to that argument that practices are constitutive of subjects and objects. So I'm suggesting that we have practices, problematizations, and the real as interacting sets of relations. The study of problematizations, I suggest, therefore, makes an important contribution to studies of enactment. In the new book, Susan Goodwin and I marshal examples of application of WPR to illustrate how problematizations play a key role in the interrelated production or constitution or enactment, whichever language you prefer, of the problems, objects, subjects, and places through which governing takes place. Many of the examples in the book come from the AOD field, and I thank you for them. Recent applications of WPR by Manson and Eckendall and Manton and Moore, respectively, show how, through problematizations in specific sites, cannabis and intoxication are produced as objects for thought, and youth and men and women are constituted as particular kinds of subjects. Now, some reflections. Over the years, while I've been developing and modifying the WPR approach, nothing is frozen in time, folks. Hopefully, we all keep reading and changing our minds on things. I've been encouraged at times to alter, can you believe, the wording, what's the problem represented to be? The term that has concerned people is represented, representations. And this concern is understandable, given the theoretical commitment in post-structuralism to challenge a correspondence view of knowledge. It's been suggested that on these grounds, it might be preferable to talk about problem enactments rather than problem representations. One reason I have thought seriously shouldn't give me so much to think about implementing such a change is that the term represented often leads to a view that WPR can be used to study competing interpretations of a problem. And to avoid this misunderstanding, I emphasize that to say that a policy represents a problem in a particular way does not imply that we are talking about an image or impression of the problem as if we could wish it otherwise. Rather, we're talking about how the problem is made to be a particular sort of problem within a specific policy with all sorts of effects, as in question 5 on the chart. I use different languages to describe how this occurs, including how policies produce things, or constitute things, or enact things. But I retain the term problem representations to refer to how problems are characterized and conceptualized within specific policies and elsewhere. So the last point on the slide, starting from text, broadly understood, then problem representations that are enacted as the real. So I think that asking what's the problem represented to be encourages researchers to engage with these conceptualizations of problems. And as I've argued today, interrogating such problematizations is an important mediating step in understanding how practices enact things, subjects, objects, highlighting the usefulness of this form of engagement. Returning to my opening comments, a particular concern in this paper has been to highlight that in treating so-called problems as taken for granted, as givens, researchers can produce or reinforce dangerous realities. That is, drug problems as taken for granted ills to remove, and a problem-solving or evidence-based ethic that denies the politics involved in constituting problems as particular sorts of problems. Hence, I return to my opening call to rein in the concept and to substitute a study of problematizations. To assist researchers in identifying potentially dangerous uses of the term problem, self-problematization forms a critical part of the WPR approach, and you can see that as step 7 on your chart, where it says, apply the list of questions to your own problem representations, which is not fun to do, deeply uncomfortable. In earlier work, I tended to use the term reflexivity, a concept popular in much post-structural and other social theory, though I was always uncomfortable with the term. Important contributions from Liza Mazzei and Isabel Stengers explain the grounds of my discomfort. They point out that the notion of reflexivity relies upon a political subject who appears to be able to draw upon resources of insight and judgment, a subject reminiscent of the humanist subject. Troubling indeed. Self-problematization attempts to bypass this difficulty by making the act of thinking itself an object of thought. It institutes a practice of the self, an actual exercise, in which one subjects one's own recommendations and proposals to a WPR analysis. In respect of political implications, such a practice creates the opportunity for researchers to consider the operation of frameworks of meaning in their analyses that could have limitations and possible deleterious effects, such as harm, responsibility, well-being, social inclusion. Now, this call for self-problematization illustrates the political ethic underpinning WPR, which is described aptly by Wendy Brown, and we're just about at the end. Brown explains that the kind of post-structural approach offered here does not prescribe political positions, nor does it describe desirable futures. Rather, it aims to make visible why particular positions and visions of the future occur to us, and especially to reveal when and where those positions work in the same register of political rationality as that which they purport to criticize. In line with this objective, WPR does not suggest that researchers ought to create problems, but that they be encouraged to engage in, quoting Foucault, a work of problematization and of perpetual reproblematization. I've been asked recently in a couple of fora, I've been in Sweden recently, I just tripped back and forth across the oceans, about the possible inadequacy. I said, inadequacy? Yes, inadequacy of such a form of critical analysis, given that we live in an age of alternative facts, fake news, and public marches to defend science. We have here a reworked version of an earlier debate that I'm sure you recognize. In response, I continue to see an important role for the kind of analysis WPR facilitates, in order first to help to identify the boundaries of acceptability for claims to the truth, what Foucault would call the rules of the game, politicizing such claims. And second, to keep us aware of the limits of our own explanations, holding us constantly open to new formulations, new problematizations and problematics. With these goals in mind, I would like to see the concept problem and associated usages, problem solving, reined in and tamed. To this end, I'm asking researchers to approach it warily, to check when and how it appears in their work. A frightening exercise if you do a command find on your most recent publication and look for where problem appears. Don't blame me. And consider the political implications of specific usages. I'm not saying you're going to throw it out, but I'm asking you to think about it. Finally, I would like them to consider the rich possibilities of interrogating problematizations in studies of enactment, to help identify patterns in modes of governing, to examine how certain ways of governing are rationalized, to consider how certain modes of governing produce objects and elicit subjects of particular kinds, to contemplate how it is possible to adopt unthinkingly frameworks of meaning that undermine our objectives, and to create space to think about how not to be governed thus. Thank you very much. Thank you.